Hi everybody, my name is Marina. I wanted to start us off with takeaways. This is what I hope you get out of today. So firstly, how to improve your workflows with contractors. I am a composer and an audio engineer, but hopefully everyone will be able to take something away from today. Secondly, things you might not know that your composer is responsible for on your games. And lastly, how to get your composer involved in marketing. I don't think that we talk about this nearly often enough in the industry. And I'll give examples. So in terms of an agenda, let's talk about how to plan, how to do music design. Let's talk about the writing process and how to give good feedback, finalizing and implementing music, as well as, again, marketing. This is more so for me. I could talk about this for hours. This will be 10 minutes, so we are going to cover a lot of ground, but it's going to be a little bit shallow, so if you want to cover anything else, feel free to email me. I'll have my email at the very end. Let's get into it. All right, hello, my name's Marina. My journey into games actually started in tech. I spent most of my career in tech. I was at Slack for 5 years before auditioning for and getting accepted into a class at Juilliard when I lived in New York. I've been a musician my whole life, but it never felt like it could be something that I could do professionally up until I did this course. And that really took, all of my, I'm a vocalist as well, so all my singing skills and instrumental skills and skills as a musician, and helped me translate it to eventually become a profession. I freelance full time. So most notably in gaming, I was one of the composers for a game called God of Rock that released last year. It's a blend of a rhythm and a fighting game, so it was really cool to work on a rhythm game where music is such a big, big mechanic. And a couple cool things came out of that. We were featured on Rolling Stone's Twitch channel. Jacksepticeye played our game for like half hour, and we were all just sitting there like, this is the coolest thing ever. And we were also nominated for Best Fighting Game at the Game Awards last year, which, again, pinch me moment. Like every time I say that out loud, I'm like, damn guys, we did good. All right, so let's talk about planning for music and music design in your video game. As a composer, I love to be a part of a project as early on as I possibly can be. And I think it's important to anchor the conversation here because I think good planning leads to good results. You can tell that I did a lot of project management probably in much of my career. But when we think about music, I really like to anchor ourselves on mood. So if it's a narrative game, what's the story that we're telling? And tell me every single beat, every single arc. I want to know what the characters are going through, and if they have character arcs, if there are going to be multiple characters that we're really examining. But regardless of whether it's a narrative game or a non-narrative game, ultimately as a composer, I want to know what emotion we're trying to evoke in the player, and I think music is such a key tool for that. But simply talking about things is, I don't think, going to get us the entire way there, because if I sit down with an audio director or a game director, or potentially a solo developer, we might sit down and say, let's write an adventure theme. I might be thinking of one thing, they might be thinking of another, and that's why I think it's important to anchor ourselves in musical references, right? How can we lean on existing music to communicate with each other? And I think this is so, so, so important because it helps us alleviate a lot of headaches that we could potentially have in the future. And lastly, music design. How are we going to implement the music? Are we going to use middleware? I'll talk a little bit more about middleware in a second, but an important conversation to have is this notion of vertical versus horizontal music resequencing. And I'll talk a little bit about what that is, and I have a video. I'll be cringing when I play this, hopefully you won't. So horizontal music is, and I'll age myself a little bit, but if you played like Pokemon Yellow and Pokemon Silver, and you're out in the world, going around, maybe you go into grass and you're looking for Pokemon, but you have like the overworld theme playing. When you go into battle, you have a second piece of music. When you get out of battle, you have a third piece of music, the victory music. And then you're back to the first adventuring theme. And so horizontal music resequencing is having one song play, an event happens, another song plays, an event happens, another song plays. Vertical, I think, is a lot more creative. With vertical music sequencing, we think about music in all of its layers and all of its instruments. And we can take some away, we can add more. I think a great example is for a boss battle. Let's say the first half of the boss battle is going to be only certain instruments, and then the second that we get the boss down to 50% health, we might introduce more percussion, more brass, make it more epic, all depending on the story that we're trying to tell. So here's a little video. I'll be cringing. Hopefully you don't. And this is done in Fmod, which is audio middleware. All right, so first we'll look at an example of vertical music resequencing based off of different parameters that happen, and then we'll take a look at horizontal. So what happens if our character dies?
As we amp it up,
Can you hear?
we can slowly start to
Turn it up a
see,
bit, barely.
we're increasing the dB on these strings. We already have the synth fully coming in.
Is that better? More?
You can see the strings, we're increasing those string
A
staccatos.
little more.
More.
Also got some flutes and some percussion here.
Sweet. Good.
So percussion coming in now is ramping up the intensity, and let's listen with the flute. This is an example piece, so it's not fully orchestrated, although the vision is fully orchestrated. I love those flutes. So what happens now if we go underwater? I'm going to set the water to 1, and let's listen. So this is from the beginning. If we're underwater, we're EQing the top end of the instrumentation, but we're also introducing this heartbeat over here as well. Because I feel like that makes it really, really claustrophobic, and when you're underwater, you're thinking, you know, the player is thinking and the character is thinking, how long can I hold my breath for? So let's take that off. We're out of the water now. What happens if our health goes all the way down to 0? We get a bit of a transition, and then we go to this section, which is the death music.
And so that's how I like to think about.
I'll walk through this
Ooh.
quickly. I don't want to make it too.
Just one, please. That's how I like to think about music design. Where are we going to have changes in music? Where are we going to have changes in the verticality based off of things that are happening in the game? And I very much believe in plan 2, 3, 4, 5 times, cut once. If you can, there's always going to be iteration, but I really, really think that planning stage is key. When we go into writing, my key takeaway here is that brainstorming and writing generally, I think, works best if we iterate a lot. And that means that both sides have to get really good at giving feedback. So whether you are a solo developer, whether you're a founder of a studio, whether you are the game director or the audio director, whoever is responsible for making the final call on music, hopefully your composer can have you be comfortable providing feedback, and hopefully the composer can also be comfortable providing feedback to you as well. But generally, when we're brainstorming and writing, I think it makes a lot of sense to send over ideas that are not fully fleshed out, get feedback, implement that feedback, send over another draft, get feedback, implement that feedback, and have a loop, as opposed to spending like 5 hours orchestrating this massive, massive song and then for it to not land at all. But eventually we get to an approvals process. So a couple of notes here. I think an iterative approach, again, very important, but I think it has to be doused in empathy and open communication. So there has to be honesty from both sides, but also kindness from both sides. But also important questions to ask: who needs to be involved with approvals if it's a bigger studio, and by when does each song need to get done? So I'll touch on production plans in a second. Finalizing and implementing, I think this is the piece that a lot of people don't see, and especially in indie and even in AA, composers are also responsible for the technical side of mixing and mastering, or at least I have been in the future, and luckily have the skills to do these things in the past. So at a very high level, mixing is taking all of the instruments in a song and making them sound good together. So at a basic level, it's deciding what's going to be in what ear, how loud every instrument's going to be. But it is a very technical practice that if I start talking about it, we're not going to leave tonight. Mastering is the final polish. It's also a very technical discipline, but it's taking the final song, adding the final technical polish, ensuring that it's loud enough for distribution, and also doing a devices check. So let's say we have a console game and it's also going to release on Steam. Your audio engineer better be checking that, or your composer better be checking that master on a TV, on maybe laptop speakers, PC speakers, and various types of headphones to make sure that it sounds good. And lastly, implementation. So again, during that planning stage, did we decide that we were going to use middleware? If so, are we using Fmod, which I just showed? Are we going to use Wise, which is another major one? Are we going to implement directly an engine? I just worked on a game where we implemented vertical music resequencing in Godot directly, and that was cool to see. But again, a production plan keeps us on track. So I generally co-create something like this with a producer if I'm working with a bigger studio. If I'm working with a solo dev, then just with the founder. But this just helps us stay on track. So typically I'll put this in Slack, I'll pin it to a Slack channel so that people have full visibility, full purview and transparency into what I'm working on, or I send it off as a weekly email. I think this is super, super, super important. And lastly, marketing. So what are some of the things that we did for God of Rock? The first one, we did these composer interviews because it was a rhythm game. There were a few composers, so we did these composer interviews with our game producer that eventually got picked up by Xbox, so this actually lives on Xbox's YouTube channel. It was great press for us, and they made an entire article on it as well, which was awesome. Of course, social media, so our primary platform was Twitter, so the God of Rock account would tweet something, we would retweet it, or we would tweet something, they would retweet it. But also streaming, and actually our voice director, Kira Buckland, who, if you played Nier Automata, she plays 2B. She was our voice director as well as an actor in the game, and I think she was the first one to stream, and then a bunch of us were like, we should stream this too. How funny would it be if the musicians were really bad at this game? Which, don't ask me to play against you, I'm not very good, even on my own songs. But a couple takeaways: ask your composer how comfortable they would be participating in marketing, first and foremost, and if they're going to play a big role, maybe include some terms in their contract for that as well, to say, hey, we want you doing marketing for X amount of hours, and here are roughly the activities that we want you to do. Thank you so much, everybody. Hopefully that was on time. If you have follow-up questions, or you want to deep dive into anything, I can really truly talk about these things for hours and hours. So I'm spending less time on Twitter now, more time on Blue Sky if you'd like to follow me. But email also works really, really well. So again, if you want to book a meeting, talk about anything, or if you need a composer for your game, I am currently booking for next year. Thank you so much. Woo! Any questions?
Okay. So we are working on a game project. How close will you work with sound design to make sure the sound design and the music, they sound cohesive?
I think it depends on size of studio. So like if you're working with, I haven't worked AAA yet. I would like to one day. If you're working AAA, everyone's kind of going to have their role. If it's AA or if it's indie, then hopefully you have music working with sound design in some capacity. If I have only been working on music in the past, typically I've at least spoken to sound design to understand kind of what they're working on, but generally I wouldn't, in the projects that I've worked on in the past, haven't been in that situation implementing. So typically we want our sound effects to be a little bit louder than our music, otherwise we don't understand kind of what is happening as the player and getting that input back. There are situations where your composer will also be your sound designer, and so that makes it easier. But I would say generally it depends on the genre of game. It depends on what the sound designer is doing that the musician isn't. I've worked on games where I've done some sound design and implemented it directly into the music because it was a faster way to implement. So I think at minimum having a conversation and understanding, hey, what are you working on? Here's what I'm working on. And then, for example, if they're like, man, this implementation of this one sound thing is going to be impossible, can you just put it in the music? We have done it before. So at minimum, I would say an intro is always nice, but it's so highly dependent on the game.
Thank you.
I should have repeated the question, I'm so sorry. The question was, how closely do composers work with sound designers? Sometimes they are the sound designers, sometimes they're not. Ario, I'll let you decide, please.
Yeah. Why would you use FMOD or WISE versus Metasound in Unreal or the equivalent in Unity? Why do you use a third-party middleware that you have to pay for versus the built-in solution?
Yeah, so the question is, why would you use audio middleware versus using and doing something kind of fully in-engine? I would say the big difference there is that if audio people are responsible for implementation, it's a lot easier for us to work in middleware because it looks more like our digital audio workstation. And so for us, we can be like, okay, well, I know what this is going to look like. I'm going to set up all of these parameters. Those parameters are going to carry over to Unity and to Unreal, and then we can control them from FMOD in the game engine. But I think the big thing there is that if I'm going to be responsible for implementation, I personally, and I know a lot of peers, are going to be a lot more comfortable in something like FMOD as opposed to doing something in-engine. So I think a lot of it depends on who's going to be implementing, what does that look like, who has experience implementing, etc. I don't know exactly what the rate structure is for FMOD and WISE. I would imagine it would be similar to if your game makes X amount of revenue, then you start to pay.
500,000 for FMOD and 250,000 for WISE.
There you go. Thank you.
Very specific. Right?
Also, Unity does not have a Metasound support.
Sorry, could you repeat that into the mic?
500,000 revenue threshold for FMOD, 250,000 USD, I'm assuming?
USD, yeah.
Revenue threshold for Wise.
Oh, I'm choosing someone in the back.
What is your personal and professional opinion regarding sending references of existing soundtracks to composers? So make it like this or sound like this. I'm thinking it probably differs personally and professionally.
Yeah, this is such a great question. It's, the question is, how would a composer take receiving feedback by also receiving music references from someone else? Is that kind of the question?
Yes, exactly.
I think it really, really depends on the composer. At the end of the day, I feel like, I don't want to throw anyone under the bus, but I feel like the most important thing as a composer is your job is to bring the vision to life, right? So I think as a composer, you kind of have to put your ego aside and be like, I know what I'm doing. I know my music theory. I know my production. I know my mixing. I know my mastering. And I could write the best song in the world, but if it doesn't fit in with the vision of the game and narratively what we're trying to tell and the emotion that we're trying to evoke in the player, then the best song in the world that might be, really complex in terms of orchestration is just not going to fit. So I personally love receiving references because, again, for folks who don't work in music very closely, I think it's really difficult to have the language to say, I want this. So I would much rather receive, a piece from another composer saying, hey, I really like this, and then I can say, oh, well, that's a staccato, or that's a whatever, and I know the music language for it. So I always really, really appreciate getting feedback with references. I know some other people don't, so I think a lot of it is kind of reading the room. But again, at the end of the day, the most important thing for a composer is to bring the game's vision to life. It's not about, oh, me and my music. It's about what is the player going to feel, and are we achieving that feeling and emotion in the player?
That's a wrap.
Thank you.